Hi, Fred. I'm actually taking a little bit of a different approach with you because your forehand is really, really good, especially for the fact that you said you didn't really have any, formal training. There are a lot of things really, really good. And the tweak that I want to give you is so minuscule that I want to show you by walking you through the stages of the forehand, showing you Djokovic, what you're kind of having to tweak, right? Because of course he does everything perfectly. So once we are through that, we'll get into the specifics for your shot. Usually I kind of do that a little bit more side by side, but I do want to run through the stages here, showing you Djokovic real quick, so you got a better understanding then for your forehand. So let's look at Novak. Obviously perfect in pretty much everything he does. I always start with the grip. So he has, very similar to you, a semi-Western, almost Western. He's not in either one of them full. And I think from what I can see with you, you're not full in a Western grip either. So the one thing that you always have to think about is the grip demands the swing path. And then based on that swing path, your stroke, your contact point will look different than other people with different grips. But I picked him because you have very similar grips. So you mentioned that you see that higher players or pro players can pretty much effortlessly generate power. And I'll show you exactly where that comes from. So let's look at some of the other things. On the take back here, you've heard the term probably unit turn, right? And this is when the right shoulder and the right hip come back, and then of course the racket as well. And we're going to look very specifically to your right hip and your right leg, because that is where the magic happens. And I think that's where you can be a little bit more aggressive in your loading. So let's keep moving through. So you see the unit turn here. Left arm comes over to help bring the racket back and facilitate, again, that deeper unit turn, right? And that is exactly what you need. And now look at where he's generating most of his power. So you see this here, the load of the outside, or in this case, the back leg. That is, I think, where you can make the biggest strides if you load a little bit more and deeper. And what I mean with deeper is his right shoulder coils a little bit more than yours. I think what you mentioned in your email is that you use your right leg primarily as a gauge to gauge the distance, which is perfectly fine. That's exactly what you need to be doing. But the next step is that you become a lot more active in loading that outside leg, that you're dipping a little deeper and a little bit more deliberately, because this is where you start generating power, right? By pushing down into the ground, by sinking a little lower, you create energy. You then momentarily store it. And see, here's where it starts to be released at this point. So everything before this point, it was preparation. The unit turn, racket back, left arm helping, the non-dominant hand helping your unit turn. From here on out, and this is called the lock-in position, and I'm always referring to Dr. Mark Kovac's work, who is phenomenal. So if you really, really want to get deeper into stuff, you got to get some of his courses, because he's phenomenal. So the lock-in position happens when the butt of the racket points to the incoming ball. And usually I'm very, very cautious when I talk about the lag of the wrist. I don't know if you've ever heard that in any of the other YouTube videos. There's a lot of talk about lag and snap. I don't teach the snap, because the snap happens naturally as part of what's called the kinetic chain. I started talking about the ground as a source of power. You generate the power coming from your feet, through your legs, through your hips, your torso, your shoulders, elbow, and then wrist. And if you put in the energy, right, if you create the energy with that load, the energy then travels through your body, and that snap That rotation of the wrist over the ball happens naturally. You don't have to force that. So that is where I'm really, really cautious and even starting to teach that lag of the racket, because also that happens very naturally if you load enough, if you put in enough, work basically in the beginning of the motion so that the rest of it then can happen naturally. So again, from the lock-in position, this is the end of the preparation. And so let's go back just a smidgen further again. See here, so the hip is still not fired, but now it starts to uncoil. So the whole thing, think about a spring, and now you're uncoiling the whole thing. See how he's lifting up even? He's not jumping or anything. That's just how much energy these guys create by pushing into the ground and then coming up. And then boom, contact point in front. And you notice here, without much effort, it looks like, right? Both of his feet are up in the air. So that's not deliberately hopping or anything. That's just because of that load. Contact point, from this angle, we can't quite see it as well, is in front of the center of gravity, in front of the hip. You see that the elbow is not completely extended, and that is because of the grip. If you had a more traditional grip, like a continental grip, you see an extended arm. So, and this is where I'm really careful again with that lag and snap, because don't snap. Try to work on that lag a little bit more, because the rotation of the hand over the biceps or over the shoulder then, that makes the racket go here. This is where the rotation happens, right here, right? You see the wrist turning. That happens naturally if you load it properly. So don't force that part. That is where I'm really, really cautious. Usually I don't even bring this up because it messes people up more than it helps them. And I've also had people come to me that had wrist issues because they worked on the lag and snap. So work on the lag, work on the load. And then you see the one thing maybe a little bit more than in your motion is that he finishes very far away from his head, right? That elbow is up and out. Yours comes around a little tighter, which is fine, but that's where you can maybe work a little bit more of the extension, and hopefully that would take care of, not feeling jammed as much. So that is Novak Djokovic. That's his forehand. And you see how much coil all of that had, so that he's literally totally kind of twisted like a pretzel, right? And that again comes from that very first loading here, there, right? So that's very deliberately done. That's not just gauging to get behind the ball. That is where the magic happens. And I think that's where you can make huge improvements if you get a little bit more aggressive with that. So let's look at your video. I got you here. I'm choosing the very first forehand that you showed me because it has the best angle. The other ones are a little further in front, so I'm having a little harder time seeing exactly where you're making contact. And then we'll also go into one other thing that has to do with your stance. So if you think back to Novak's forehand, let's see what components you have in place. And you pretty much have every single one in place except for the lock-in. That can be a little bit different there. So what I really do like is you're very active here, helping yourself. Let me see if I can change the color here. Helping yourself with your offhand, bringing your shoulder around, right? So you have that unit turn, and I would like it a little deeper, specifically here in the hips. So to my mind, if you turn those hips a little bit more, you get that load a little bit more. And I do like, very much so, those little adjustment steps here. Adjustment, adjustment, adjustment. And this is where we need to work a little bit more. So you have a little bend here, but it's not a very deliberate and low load. And if you can sink into this load a little bit more, and then push up from that position, that is where the rest of everything happens. That's when you're starting to really feel that energy release through your hips into the ball. Then your shoulders rotate into the ball. And lastly, your arm comes through. All right, so let's look at that lock-in position here, because I think that happens just a smidgen too late because you're not coiling as much as Djokovic. But then again, who does anything better than Djokovic? So we can get to this here. So see here, I think at the earliest I can make out that lock-in position here. So butt cap points to the ball here, but the ball is basically already there. If you think back to the video that I showed you of Novak, the ball would have been somewhere around here. And the difference there is, to my mind, your hips have already fired a little bit because you never sank quite as low and as deliberately and as aggressively into your ball. So that to me is really where everything cool happens. When you're doing that load a little bit more, hopefully you'll then also not feel as jammed. Although I can't see that here in this, from this angle, I think you're hitting it well in front. That's exactly where you need to hit it. You hit it well in front of your center of gravity. So that's exactly where you want to hit it. On your follow through, you do see that here, how your wrist comes around. So don't change that, don't force that, because that's where we don't want to have it. That forcing it, right? It should happen naturally. The only one thing, if you want to feel a little bit more in that extension here, a little bit longer, and then come around, right? So that when you're done, basically, the elbow does not come up as you finish. The elbow is already far extended and away from your arm, from your head, right? And it's perfectly fine to finish like you do over your biceps there, although probably your racket dips a little too much. But we do have different finishes. Just think of Nadal, right? He has that buggy whip. It depends a little bit. I can't see what you did with that ball. I would say more, if I see this finish, it would indicate to me that you hit a shorter, heavier topspin cross court, because that's usually what we need to do to generate that angle, right? But finishes high over your left shoulder are fine. Finishes over your biceps are fine. So the good old adage, finish high over your shoulder, is not necessarily always true. It really depends on what kind of shot you're hitting. All right, so the next thing I do want to talk about is, because in all of your examples, and I think I cut this off. Yeah. So in all of your examples, you showed me that you're hitting an open stance only. So here's your open stance. And to my mind, this here would be not necessarily an open stance, but a semi-open stance. And go back to the video that I showed you of Djokovic. If your right foot is slightly behind your left, that's a semi-open. If they're both parallel to one another, that is your open stance if your hips face to the net. Right? So this stance I would use predominantly when you're actually being pulled out very far. The semi-open stance is a little easier to create that power with. It's easier to dip down into that load. So give that a whirl, that you're not necessarily using an open stance on every single ball. And I'll go into the other two shots that you showed me in just a second. All right, so let's look at the other shots that you showed me, especially from the front. So I just slowed that down a little bit. Again, this is the same shot that we looked at, a little deeper that load. So now let's look at the other two, because I think we can work with different stances a little bit more. So on this one, to my mind, you can move more, and not leap into the ball. See here how that energy basically is from here spilling over, and you have to take another step to keep your balance, right? That little mogul step, I call that from skiing. That is something that I think, again, would be more appropriate if you're on the full run and you're being pulled out of the court. So that is to me that you're needing to get a little bit more behind the ball. Because if you're having to use this step here to almost leap into the ball, then that tells me that you didn't have time to really load, right? There's no load behind that ball. So again, this should be the part where you're not just continuing to use through, you're already behind the ball, and that load needs to be deeper. So to me, again, that's a little footwork issue that doesn't allow you then to generate as much pace, because you're still kind of, concerned with just getting to the ball. The next one, and I'll show you a really great example that I found, is where I think it would be appropriate for you to hit a close stance, actually, right? Where you are choosing to get up there and you have very small steps here and you can't really load. See here how you're already leaning into the ball instead of really loading down, right? And then I think on this ball, right, you're kind of hitting into the net because you're leaning into it, but over it, right? So that's the difference there. So that is a great example of when it's appropriate to still hit close stance. I know that a lot of people talk about the modern forehand and modern this, that, and the other, but it is still appropriate to hit close stance balls, especially when they're that far inside the court. Look, you have both of your feet well inside the court. It's looking like it's a little bit more of a sitting ball, and you could actually transition in. I know that those are fed balls, so you're not coming in with them. But if in a match you have these balls, do transition in, maybe with a close stance, and I'll get to that in a second here. So here's that example. Tsitsipas, also, of course, pretty phenomenal. And he's choosing a close stance. So every single player on tour still has close stances in their repertoire. And the benefit of that is that look how big his strides are as he's getting up to the ball. That's closer. And this is where the load happens. So it's a lot easier if you're getting your body weight behind the ball and into the court to lead with that outside leg and then load with that outside leg. So just look at the feet here, not necessarily at anything else. See how low that is, how low that is, how low that is. And that is your close stance. Both of your feet are behind each other. They're stacked. They're both in line with where you're wanting to go. And the hips are closed, but now they're rotating open. Boom. And this is where all the power comes from. See, and you're seeing that energy then carries them forward, now landing with that right foot, and then boom, you give it a couple of extremely aggressive steps and you're in a really good volley position. So that, to my mind, is something, choosing the open stance when you're being pulled out wide, the semi-open stance when you really want to create power from the baseline. Again, go back to the Djokovic model there that I showed you. And then the closed stance here on transition balls. Bam. Okay, so let's look at your shots from the back, because then we can see that coil, that preparation, the loading a little bit better as well. So the components that we want to look at, again, same thing as we did from the side. So you're approaching the ball here. I do like the off arm, right? Your non-dominant hand comes out, brings or helps to bring your right shoulder back, lines you up with your left shoulder. And here's where, again, we want to work a little bit more on this load, right? Right hip goes down and back because you want to store energy, create energy here, store it, and then release it into this direction. So think of every single motion, any action that you have that you want to create, and the action here in this case, or reaction I should say, sorry, every reaction has an action before. So the reaction that you want to create is you want to create power going forward. So to have that happen, you have to start with an action. And that is opposite and equal to what you're trying to accomplish. So your load goes down and back, and your uncoil goes forward and up into the ball. So again, it's that old kind of example of a spring, right? You need to kind of coil it, and then boom, you can release it. And that's exactly what you're trying to accomplish with that deep load. So your outside leg here could sink in a little bit more, right? So there's not a whole lot of sinking, if you see that, like loading down low. You're using it predominantly right now to get behind the ball. So it's more of a helper engaging the distance rather than a source for power. And that, I think, is really what's crucial. So you're behind the ball. See, again, that lock-in position, to my mind, is probably happened right about now. And the ball's already there. So that is not what surprises me then when you feel like you're a little jammed, right? You're a little close to your body. And then that is good. The contact point is still out in front. Could potentially be a little bit more in if you're getting behind the ball a little bit more, right? And using that right leg to sink lower a little bit more and a little further out behind the ball, right? So that you're not as far out here. It should be a little further in, and that helps you then transition all the power that you created into the ball. And then your follow through is good, right? So see here, you follow through over your left biceps. That's perfectly fine, right? We talked about that earlier. So again, to me, I would like that right foot about here, right? Just a little bit more out so that you're then making your contact point further out in front, and it's not too far out to the side, because you basically have to reach a little bit, and that makes you jammed in that regard. You know, the distance between the ball and your shoulder, not in this plane, but the plane from the ball basically here, if I could show it that way. So that is where I think you feel hopefully then a little less jammed if you can bring your contact point in a little bit more, but out in front, if that makes sense. It's different. It's difficult to draw it here with, you know, not a 3D vision there. So the last thing that I want to point out, especially if you're going inside out, you need to come around the ball even more, right? So the last one that you gave me is an inside out. So here we go, here we go, here we go. Can this come around a little bit more, even more? Because you see now that after you hit, your energy still moves this way instead of getting around the ball with a semicircle and transitioning all your energy into the direction of the ball. And that is something that you'll see if you have the chance to maybe watch some of the pro tennis or any footage on YouTube and really slow it down. If you get footage from the back and you see when they're going inside out, how far they bring that right hip around. So for instance, Team is very extreme in how many balls over here he's taken with his forehand, or Grigor Dimitrov. Sometimes I'm thinking he's actually doing it a little too much because he jams himself and kind of, you know, has his body weight falling out this way every now and then. But here you just got to come around a little bit more. So your feet need to continue moving a little bit more. And then as you're hitting, your body weight continues to move forward back into the direction of the ball. And that's exactly what you want to have happen on all of your shots with your forehand. But as I said, I think I really, really like it. Again, for the fact that you didn't have any formal coaching so far, this is a phenomenal forehand. So I think those tweaks hopefully will help. Once you watch the video, just shoot me an email, let me know what you think, and I hope that helped.